Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jeremy. Ross Moore was supposed to present tonight, but fortunately been struck down by COVID. But he's fine, he's okay, but he's recovering. And he said it'd be fine to do the remaining 4 sessions this month. So apologies if you've particularly come to see Ross. But he's given me some points that he's asked me to present to you, which will be a good preparation for the other material that he's going to present this month. The practice of Tonglen, or giving and taking, which is a central practice in Mahayana Buddhism for generating the mind of compassion, love and compassion. So it's quite a big topic. So I think many of you come to these sessions quite regularly, so you know sort of how they run, but I'd just like to mention when I present that the purpose of these is they're supposed to be informal and just to share some ideas and Buddhist practices, and they're good if they're sort of as interactive as possible, so feel free to ask questions. We'll have time for questions and discussions at the end, and we'll do some meditation, and I'll talk a bit about the topic. And you're encouraged to challenge the ideas. The Buddha encouraged people to challenge his ideas, so don't feel like you have to agree with them. If I say anything that you disagree with, then just make a mental note and feel free to ask about it. So we'll start off by doing some meditation, which is useful for pacifying our minds, calming them down, gaining some clarity, because most of us are running around all day and our minds are very discursive, which means jumping from one mental object, one thought to the next all the time, often referred to as the monkey mind. So one of the things we're trying to achieve in meditation is to calm that discursive mental activity and develop the ability to focus on one mental object, and particularly a mental object which is going to make our minds more clear and peaceful and happy, and not a mental object which is going to disturb our mind. So that's what meditation is. So as you probably know, you may know that the definition of meditation is the process of familiarizing your mind with a positive mental object. So that's what we're trying to do when we're meditating, is to familiarize our mind with a mental object or a thought, an idea, a mental habit, which is going to make our minds more peaceful and calm and clear, as opposed to focusing on something which is going to disturb our mind. So that's what meditation is. Generally there's 2 types of meditation which presented. So there's concentration meditation, which we'll do in a minute, which means focusing your mind just on one mental object. And the other type is analytical meditation, which involves analysing a particular idea or topic and through reasoning to reach a conclusion. For example, you might meditate on impermanence, is a common object of meditation in Buddhist practice at least. So if you meditate on impermanence, for example, on the impermanence of your body, then you would think about how your body is changing from moment to moment, and every part of your body is changing, every atom. There's nothing at all staying still, even for a second. So that would be an analytical meditation where you focus on that idea and analyze, for example, your body or your mind. And then at the end of that analysis, you reach a conclusion that your body and mind are impermanent, and you focus on that conclusion using concentration. So that's the idea of analytical and concentration meditation. Okay, so we'll do a concentration meditation on the breath. So we're just focusing our mind on the breath moving in and out. And the main two faculties that we need to use when meditating, one is called mindfulness, which in this context means remembering the object that you're focusing on. So keeping it in mind, because we have the tendency for our mind to wander, as I said. So we're trying to keep that object in mind, remembering to keep your mind on that object, so in this case the breath. And then the other mental faculty that we need to use is called introspection or alertness, where you're observing what your mind is doing. So you're checking whether your mind is able to stay on that object, and then when it starts to wander, you bring it back to the object. So they're the main two tools or faculties that we need to use in order to meditate. Okay, so just sit in a posture which is comfortable and also helps you to be alert but also relaxed. So we're trying to strike a balance between being relaxed and also alert. So we're trying to avoid drowsiness. So we keeping your back straight tends to help avoid drowsiness. Having your eyes mostly closed helps to avoid discursive thought and distraction. But mostly important just to be comfortable. So then you bring your awareness to your body and just observe how your body's feeling. And stop thinking about all the things that you've been busy with during the day, all the things going on in your life. You can just have a break from thinking about those. And then bring your attention to your breath moving in and out. It can be helpful to focus particularly on the point just under the tip of your nose of the breath moving in and out past that point. So you can do that if you like. Just focus on that point. So we're using mindfulness to keep in mind the object of meditation, which in this case is the breath. So mindfulness is remembering to keep that in mind. And then introspection is observing to see whether your mind is staying on the object or wandering off, and then bringing it back if it starts to wander. If you find it helpful, you can count your breaths. Breathing in and out would be one breath. And then that's a way of checking to see whether you're remaining focused on wandering off. Just check to see if your mind has wandered or if it's remaining on the object. If your mind wanders off, you can bring it back, start counting again. And think about using mindfulness to remember the object and alertness to observe the concentration. So the whole process should be relaxing, not requiring a lot of force, and try to avoid getting frustrated if your mind keeps wandering. So you just bring it back, place it on the object. So that's part of the process. So we're giving our mind like a break from the constant discursive chattering monkey mind, just having a holiday from that for a few minutes. Then for the last minute, just make a concerted effort to try and keep your mind without wandering on the breath. Okay, that's enough. Thank you. Just relax your concentration. Any questions or comments about that before I move on? Does anyone find that particularly difficult or unpleasant? Some people do find that really hard. Yeah. So in this context, and these terms are used in various different ways, but in this context, mindfulness just means remembering the object. So a good analogy is when you're driving your car, and mindfulness is remembering to keep your mind focused on the road and what's happening when you're driving. And then alertness is sort of another mental faculty, which is checking to see whether you're remaining focused. So sometimes when you're driving, you get distracted by, your child in the back seat, for example, and you turn to talk to them something. Then alertness is telling you to bring your attention back to the road after a second. This is dangerous. Bring your attention back to the road. So that's alertness operating there to remind you. So there's two slightly different mental faculties which I think we use all the time, but we may not recognize them. So I think with meditation, it's just a process of becoming familiar with that practice, and the more familiar it becomes easier and more enjoyable, I think. So it's said in meditation traditions that just being able to focus your mind on one neutral object makes your mind peaceful and happy, and also your body more relaxed. And the more you can focus on the object, the more sort of powerful the bliss that you experience and to the point where some meditators even have too much bliss, and the bliss becomes a problem because they can't focus on the thing that they're trying to focus their mind on. So that's an interesting problem to have. Okay, so that's concentration meditation. So Ross asked me to talk about a few things which will sort of be precursory to what he's going to talk about. One thing I like to start off with, which I think is a really interesting and inspiring idea, which is the idea that, and I'd be interested to hear whether you agree with this or not, the idea that our minds have like infinite or huge potential, enormous potential that we tend not to have access to, or we tend not to use. So I remember before I became interested in meditation that one of the things that got me interested was that feeling that I felt like my mind was capable of doing a lot more than it was doing, and capable of having much sort of more stable sense of happiness and calm and peace. And so you'd get occasional glimpses of it, and that would only last for maybe a minute, and then you wonder, like, why is it that sometimes I can get these sort of profound experiences of peace and calm, and that they might only last a minute, and then very hard to get back to that. And I think that's why I became sort of interested in meditation. I felt that there must be sort of some way of accessing that more, finding more techniques for accessing that. And I'd be interested to know if you have similar experience to that. But anyway, in Buddhist teaching and also in other meditation traditions, of this idea that the mind has this sort of infinite potential, and that at the moment, temporarily, we are sort of obscured from accessing that, but we sort of get glimpses of it. And so it's by training your mind, for example, training in concentration, that you can begin to access that sort of enormous resource that we have within our minds. So if you accept that, then that's, I think, a very inspiring idea, because what it means is everything we need to be happy is actually, we already have it within us. We don't actually need to go out and accumulate a lot of possessions, for example, or a lot of friends, or a position of power, etc. We have everything we need to be happy within our mind. So I think that's a very interesting and inspiring thought. And I'd be interested to know what you think about that. How do we access that potential from the Buddhist point of view? Or what is stopping us from accessing that potential? So from the Buddhist point of view, the mind is said to be like sort of like the most powerful thing in the universe. So in the Buddhist presentation, the mind is beginningless. So they talk about beginningless mind. So then you have this idea of reincarnation. So the mind comes from the previous body and goes into the next body, and you can trace it back beginninglessly. So there's the idea of your mind having no beginning, like a continuum of mind. So that's a very interesting and sort of challenging idea, I think. But and because they have that idea of the mind being beginningless, it's said to be immutable, as in indestructible. So in the Buddhist tradition, the mind is like a very powerful force, more powerful than nuclear energy, more powerful than gravity, more powerful than black holes and the Big Bang, because it's been going on beginninglessly. So that's a very different presentation, I think, of the mind to how we normally think of it. It's a very sort of vast, and the idea is to think of your mind as being something very powerful and like an ocean that we are trying to access that vast power and infinite potential. So I think that's, whether you believe that or not, it's just an interesting idea and something to think about. Whether you could possibly, because you can see in your life that you have been able to develop your mind in some ways. You might notice, for example, when you first have young children, that it can be quite difficult and challenging, but over time you develop patience, and you find that you've developed patience to a much greater extent than you thought was possible. And you might have thought of yourself as being an impatient person, but then through these experiences you've developed these sort of qualities like patience, or you find that in your work. So you can see how it's possible to develop your mind, and your mind can, through familiarization, can develop these positive qualities or powers. So the idea is that using that as proof, if you can develop your mind to this small extent, then where does that end? If you continue that process of familiarizing your mind with something like patience, how far could you go with that? And the Buddhist idea is that you can sort of develop that almost infinitely. But it takes a while, so it's kind of like a long-term project. And Buddhists talk about many lifetimes, thousands, hundreds and thousands of lifetimes. Sorry. It's a long project. So then what is it that is stopping us from accessing that potential, that vast potential? So in the Buddhist presentation, the main obstacles we have are ignorance, is also called wrong view or mistaken views. And that's sort of like a misunderstanding how things exist. Like I was talking before about impermanence. So we often have this view that things are permanent, for example, our body or the people around us. And because of that misunderstanding, and not understanding that things are impermanent, then that creates problems for us. So that's an example of a misunderstanding of the way things exist, which causes us problems. So that's so we need to understand the mistaken views and then overcome them by meditating on the correct view, which in that case would be impermanence. So one of the problems that we have, which are caused by these mistaken views, is this feeling. In Buddhist terminology, it's often referred to as self-cherishing. But I'm not sure if that's really the best translation. It's sort of like a view of the self or the I, and having the self or the I as being the most important thing in the universe. So I guess you call it self-cherishing, or I guess self-centered perspective, thinking of the self as the most important thing in the universe. So that's said to be one of the things that's causing us a lot of problems, or be the sort of heart or root of a lot of the problems that we experience. So how does that work? So from this strong feeling of I, then we look around at the things around us, and things that appear attractive or useful to the I, then we develop attachment and craving towards them and try to bring them closer. And the things that appear unattractive or problematic or unhelpful to the self, then we try to push them away. And the things that are neither attractive or unattractive, then we sort of have a neutral, sort of disinterested feeling about them. And then, so what happens then is that based on this sense of I and this attachment and aversion, then we're placed in this situation where we're constantly trying to pull the attractive things towards us and push the unattractive or painful things away. And so it places us in this sort of constant battle that we're having with the universe. So the one Buddhist teacher describes it as, if you have this strong self-centered attitude, then you're placing yourself like this I here and the universe out there, sort of me against the universe. So you can see how that's a very sort of difficult situation that we're creating for ourselves by having this strong sense of I and me against the universe. And then from this attachment and aversion, then all other problems, for example, strong aversion leads to anger, and then we harm people through anger. And also if we're strongly attached to something and then someone takes it away or threatens it, then anger arises. And other mental afflictions such as like anxiety arises from being fearful of losing something that you're attached to, or depression arises because of not being able to achieve something that you want to, for example. So it's interesting to think about your mind, think about the things that bother you in your day-to-day life, the sort of mental afflictions or disturbing mental states that arise, and think about how they relate to the mind of self-cherishing or the self-centered mind. Like we were talking before about the discursive thoughts of the mind jumping from one thought to the next and having trouble keeping your mind focused. So that's said to be a product of attachment, because our mind is sort of always looking for something more interesting, sort of shopping around for something. So that's why we have trouble focusing our mind and keeping it on one object. So this is a sort of Buddhist psychology where you have this idea of self-cherishing, and then based on that, the idea of attachment and aversion. And then based on attachment and aversion, we have various other afflictive states like anger, anxiety, depression, jealousy, agitated mind, etc. All these things arising. And then based on that, we commit actions. So in Buddhist philosophy, there's the idea of karma. So karma is the idea that with our body and speech and mind we create action. For example, harming someone else. And then in the idea of karma, then that creates a sort of negative energy which results in future suffering for ourselves. So all these can be related back to this mind of self-cherishing. So the good news is that we can overcome all of these because they all arise from various causes and conditions. And by understanding what causes them and how they arise, then we can begin to sort of dismantle that whole process, that whole network of self-cherishing and attachment and aversion and all the things that arise from those. And one of the most powerful tools that we have for doing this is the practice of love and compassion, which Ross will be talking about this month. So by focusing on love and compassion, that acts as the direct antidote to this over-preoccupation with the self or the I. So you can see that in your own experience, that when you're focusing on others and others' welfare, it sort of takes you out of yourself. And immediately you feel your mind becoming more expansive and open, whereas previously you might be focused on me and my problems and my faults and everything that's wrong with me and my life, etc. Then you sort of take your mind out of that and focus on the people around you and think about what's going on with them. So the idea is just to sort of let go of that self-focus and open your mind up to what's going on around you. So maybe we'll do some meditation and you can sort of experience that firsthand, and then we can talk about it. So in order to develop compassion and loving kindness, the first thing we need to do is to overcome this strong tendency to categorize people into friend, enemy and stranger. So the way to overcome that is to understand that those categories are just creations of your mind. So you analyze each of those categories. So you think about people that you regard as unpleasant and think about why you think of them as unpleasant. And the reason that we do that is because there's something that they've done or some behavior or something they represent which makes us feel uncomfortable, which is some kind of a threat to us. Represents something unpleasant, something we don't like. And then, on the other hand, the people that we regard as friend, people that we regard as nice, the ones we like, we've given them that label because of the way they make us feel, because they are doing something which makes us feel happy. They represent something that we respect or appreciate. But then you can sort of debunk these categories by thinking about how that really nice person that you really respect and admire and want to be, you like being around, they could possibly do something that you find unacceptable, or they do something to harm you. And, we know from experience that this can happen. And suddenly they're changed from the category of friend into the category of enemy or unpleasant person. And vice versa, with an unpleasant person, we can completely change our view about them by developing a greater understanding of perhaps why they were behaving in that unpleasant way, or realizing that we were mistaken about what we thought about them. So by understanding that these categories of mind are actually just that, they're just mental creations that we're projecting onto these people, and that each of those people may have someone else in their life who regards them as sort of the unpleasant person, would have people in their lives who love them and think they're wonderful, and vice versa. So that's called the mind of equanimity. So we're trying to develop an attitude which sort of dismantles these very fixed categories of friend and enemy and stranger, and just regards everyone as being more or less the same, in the sense that everyone is wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of problems in exactly the same way as we are. So that's the mind of equanimity. So that's what we firstly need to do in order to develop love and compassion. And then based on that mind of equanimity, then we think about, as I said, that in the same way as I am always striving for happiness and trying to avoid problems, all others around me are exactly the same as me in this way. So you just think about that for a minute. Everyone is exactly the same as me in that they are also trying to be happy in every moment and trying to avoid problems. So this is, by meditating like this, then we develop a kind of affinity or closeness with people. We see them as being very much the same as oneself. And in the same way as I am striving for happiness, but still, even though I'm putting a lot of effort into it, I'm still experiencing various problems. And even though I'm trying to avoid all of these problems, I'm still experiencing them. So they are having the same experience as me in this regard. So again, this is an analytical meditation, so we're analysing our experience and the experience of others around us, and give rise to this feeling of affinity, or like kindness comes from the word kindred, so feeling that people are like similar or like family. And then the mind of compassion goes a bit further and develops this wish that wouldn't it be great if I could actually do something to remove the problems that others are experiencing. And love is the other side of that, of wishing to make others happy. So I think you can see that by focusing on all the people around you in your life like this, that it takes you out of this just focusing on this yourself and your own problems and your own faults. It makes your mind immediately more expansive and feel connected with the people around you, as opposed to sort of isolated and just focusing on this one I, on me. And then you try to expand that feeling out to include as many people as possible. So all the people in your life and the people live in this city and this country and the world. You also include all the non-humans, animals, who are also the same in trying to find happiness and to avoid problems. And the idea is that by doing this, we're making our minds very vast and expansive. So instead of our focus just being on this one self and on the whatever problem that we're having at the moment, that we're making our focus of our mind very expansive. Okay, thank you. So that's probably enough talking for me. So I just wanted to give you an idea tonight about the practice of love and compassion and kindness, and how it acts as a direct counter or antidote to the mind of self-centered mind, and the various problems that arise from that. So I'd be interested to hear what you think of that. Does anyone have any comments or questions or disagreements? Yes?
I always struggle with the avoiding of problems instead of just knowing that there are problems and then use the tools.
Right, yeah. So you're saying that trying to avoid problems is a problem in itself. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, I think. Because I think we find that problems is often just something that we've labelled a problem, isn't it? So in another context, that thing could actually be quite helpful. Like a difficult relationship, for example. We tend to label that a problem, but actually if you sort of engage with that difficult relationship with a different attitude, it can become something very useful, for example, for teaching you something and developing patience, for example. And yeah. So I think that's a good point, yeah. The idea is not to avoid problems, but it's also to acknowledge that we all have problematic things in our lives. It's hard to find anyone who would say they don't have any problems in their lives. Yeah.
And that confused me because there are problems.
Yeah. But do you think it would be possible to eventually overcome them, completely? Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that's a problem again, and then you just have to acknowledge the problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess. I mean, the Buddhist tradition is based on this idea of enlightenment, eventually achieving enlightenment. So the idea is eventually you can overcome all problems, but it's gradual, and part of that involves working with the problems and not just trying to avoid them. Yeah. Like even physical pain, I think, in meditation you often get pain in your knees. So it's so that you can use that discomfort as a sort of meditation to focus on it. You realise that by focusing on it you can actually change the way that it's affecting you, so it may not be pain anymore by focusing on it. I think so, yeah, eventually, but especially through using concentration. Yeah. Yes. Any other thoughts about that? Yes.
I just feel in this society that we're very quick to label things, the good things, the bad things. Like if you suffer from depression, it's like I must quickly do everything to get out of this rather than sort of staying with the pain and working out what's the source of this. Is it my job or my friendship, or am I unhappy in some way, or do I have too much or too little? Sort of label it good or bad, and if it's labeled bad, but we must get rid of it. Otherwise, it's sort of like this phrase, stay in control.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you might have heard in Buddhism that one of the the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught was that this existence we have is actually problematic. So some people complain that Buddhism is sort of too pessimistic because it focuses on this, but in some ways I think it can be a relief, because people tend to think that there's something wrong with me because I have problems. But then actually when you investigate, there's actually everybody is having some, various types of problems. So you don't actually blame yourself anymore. You just think this is sort of how we are at the moment. But then, then the Buddha said, well, but it doesn't have to be like this. You can do things about it. But in some ways it's kind of a relief to realize that yeah, well, that's like Slady was saying, that if you change your attitude towards that problem, then it can maybe no longer be a problem, because you see that it's something your mind is sort of involved in creating that problem by labeling it a problem. Whereas if you sort of can use it in some way as a way of developing your mind, making your mind stronger. For example, difficult relationship, can you develop your mind and become more patient? Yeah. So then it's not a problem. It's actually a good condition for developing your mind. So in Buddhist cosmology, there's these beings called devas. They live in this sort of apparently blissful, godlike world, and they just sort of hang out and drink blissful nectar and dance and party. But it's said to be a very undesirable form of existence, because what happens is, because you're not experiencing any kind of problems, your mind doesn't develop. You're just sort of in this sort of state of bliss, and eventually you use up all your good karma, and then you go to unfortunate rebirth. So, whether you believe that or not, it's sort of an analogy that actually having, challenges or difficulties in your life is actually quite useful, particularly for spiritual practice, when you want to develop compassion and patience and etc. Yeah. So what do you think about the idea that our problems come from this self-centered attitude? Does that make sense to you? And the idea of self-centered attitude giving rise to attachment and aversion, which gives rise to other things like anxiety, depression, anger, etc. Does that sort of presentation of psychology sound right to you? Anyone disagree?
Is that part of the human condition?
You mean having those things in your mind? Is that part of the human condition? I think you'd say it is, yeah. But when you say part of the human condition, like from the Buddhist point of view, they call it adventitious, as in they're not intrinsic to our nature. So, for example, if we have anger, it doesn't mean that we have to have anger, because we can remove the causes of anger and stop it from arising by developing patience. So generally we all have those things, but we're not sort of stuck with them. We can remove them.
That leads back into the human, into the ego, isn't it? It's to do with the ego as well. So it's a continual incarnation, I suppose, of working with the ego and trying to transform that.
Yeah, so I think probably the Buddhist equivalent of ego would be this self-centered feeling that this I is the most important thing in the universe, commonly referred to as self-cherishing. And then from that, because we have this exaggerated view of the importance of I and me and mine, that these other problems arise. And so that's why the practice of love and compassion is said to be so powerful for dismantling that or pacifying that.
I would think
Yeah. So I think the Buddhist idea is that Buddhists are said to have sort of like unbearable compassion, but at the same time their minds are like not disturbed. So I'm not quite sure how that works. But it's sort of like one teacher described it as all the Buddhas are all focused on you right now, and they're all thinking about what they could do to try and relieve your problems and lead you to enlightenment. And that's all they're thinking about and all they want to do. So it's sort of like a spontaneous feeling that you have when you're enlightened, that all you want to do is remove the suffering of others. That's the idea. But at the same time, your mind is said to be completely free of any kind of disturbance, so you're not feeling stressed by it. That's the idea. Whereas I think we tend to look at other people's suffering and then we feel it's quite upsetting, and we tend not to want to think about. So we need to find a way of developing that feeling of compassion and love that is in a way that's not disturbing, that sort of is motivating us to do something. Yeah, I think we tend to be detached, don't we, because it's painful. You look at people suffering around the world, in a war zone, for example. You tend not to want to look at it because it's painful. The idea is to sort of focus on that in a way that develops this mind of, firstly, closeness, and then thinking, what can I do to maybe help? Sort of thing.
Isn't there discomfort in the situation you're describing partly caused by the sense of hopelessness in not being able to help?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. I think there is, I guess, two elements that we experience when we hear someone else suffer, or we think about the worrying and crying.
Yeah.
We feel terrible because of the suffering.
Yeah.
But we also might feel hopeless. In the
Yeah.
sense that, oh, I wish I could do something.
Yeah.
So I feel that need to help.
Yeah.
Certainly the compassion is that, but then that sense of, oh, how can I?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. So we tend to...
And it's a compounding.
And it's sort of like you don't really want to think about it because it makes you feel more sort of helpless, like you said, yeah. So that sort of makes you feel worse in a way. Yeah, so I think some of the Buddhist practices of compassion are particularly aimed at overcoming that feeling. For example, the visualizations you do when you imagine that there's sort of light coming out of your heart and going out to all beings and filling them with bliss. So even though you're not actually doing that, and you can't do that, it gives you some kind of confidence about feeling that there is something you can do to help others. I think that's the idea, because we tend to have this feeling, a very limited view of myself, I can't even solve my own problems, let alone all the problems of the world. So it's sort of to overcome that and just sort of start to think about yourself in a more, I guess a more expansive way, think, or maybe there is something I could do, or even just having that attitude, there is things I can do, rather than thinking, it's all too hard, I can't even think about it, sort of thing, yeah. Courage, I think it's a form of courage. Yep.
What is the attitude? Because we've got limited attention in our lives, and we can focus on really positive things, beautiful things, simple things, peaceful things.
Yeah.
We can focus on our attention on the war and the cruelty and the suffering.
Yep.
Buddhist attitude, because it's just, I think if you focus on good things and you kind of ignore some of the worst things, you can make it really good, feel good.
Yeah.
It just depends how you do it. What is the attitude generally? How do you put your attention?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think Buddhists talk about being very skillful, or skillful which means sort of doing whatever is best for your own state of mind. So for example, if you just think about the war in Ukraine all the time, 24 hours a day and you're watching it on YouTube, etc., then your mind could just become, like disturbed and upset and depressed. So we need to be sort of skillful. Maybe it's good to think about that, meditate on that problem of that war, for example, in a way that's useful for you to develop these states of mind of compassion. But maybe you should only do it for 5 minutes a day, and the rest of the time we're better off maybe just focusing on something else, like your breath, or focusing on what you're doing at the moment, like washing the dishes, or whatever it is. So yeah, we need to be... so it's said that when our minds are down, that we should meditate on something which lifts the mind up. For example, I was talking about the mind having infinite potential. So thinking about that could lift up your mind. And if your mind becomes too sort of scattered or too proud or too kind of haughty, then you can meditate, for example, on your faults. You think, why am I feeling so proud of myself? Actually, I have these, faults. So it's a way you need to sort of be skillful, like, flying an airplane or something like that. Is that what you're talking about?
I really asked the question, which is how as Buddhists you should focus your attention, because if you're very optimistic, you can wake up and see a beautiful sunrise, you can see the birds chirping, you can see a beautiful world.
Yeah.
You can kind of go through your day with that attitude and actually have a really good, or you can see all the negatives. It's just how you focus your attention. And the question I already said to you is, how should you focus your attention? Because you can focus on cruelty, wars, you can focus on sunrise and birds and just see all the good things. And I think a lot of it, it's my first time of the session, but I think a lot of it is how you focus your attention. Because for someone who doesn't watch TV hypothetically, they're not going to know much about the war in Ukraine. It's not going to necessarily cause problems, etc. And it can change your whole attitude. It's just what you're putting your attention to. I was wondering should you be focusing on negative or positive, or is there a general idea? Does Buddhism tell you how to focus your attention?
Good question. Sorry, I think I misunderstood you first. So I think the answer I think is still a bit the same, because in reality all of those things are happening, aren't there? There's all these good things happening and all these bad things happening in the world. So as you say, we have a choice about which ones we want to focus on. So we're trying to achieve a goal. We're trying to develop the mind. So you can choose to focus on things based on what you're trying to achieve. So, you can focus on, the beautiful sky, rainbow, clouds that makes your mind feel happy. But then if you do that all day, is it really achieving your goal, So sometimes maybe it's better to think about, the war in Ukraine, the suffering, then you develop this mind of compassion. Because you never think about that, then your compassion won't arise, because you're just focusing on the beautiful, rainbow sort of thing. So I think the answer is again similar. We choose to focus on according to what is necessary for the mind, how we're trying to develop the mind. Neutrality could be useful to some extent, but then it could also be problematic. So if you're completely neutral about everything, and you sort of don't really allow things to affect you, then that could just sort of make your mind, in this sort of maybe slightly, it could be useful in calming your mind down, but it might not be helpful in terms of developing something like patience, for example, where you might need quite a confronting situation which helps you to develop patience. So, I think we need all of them. Sorry, we've run out of time and I think people want to go. So, good discussion. Thank you. It's fine, that's fine. So thank you for listening, and hopefully Ross will be back next week and he will continue particularly talking about this practice of developing love and compassion called Tonglen. Thanks.